and gentlemen, we are live, as this is the main event you've all been waiting for. Brought to you by Axonius, the cybersecurity asset management company. It's time!
Hey, Cloud Security Podcast, Steve from Bridge Crew here. Check us out to start scanning your infrastructure as code against hundreds of security policies, both on the command line and in your IDE. Bridge Crew also adds security feedback to all your commits and helps you fix misconfigurations in both code and runtime.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Coffee with Ashish. And as this weird thing comes up on my screen, this amazing things that happen in live, why isn't it going away? So let me just quickly fix that while I figure this thing out. I don't know where that's coming from. I see that. There you go. Welcome, welcome again. So I'm going to start again. Welcome to Cloud Security Podcast, Virtual Coffee with Ashish. My name is Ashish, and we do these kind of interviews every week, and we talk about different topics. This is the beginning of a new month, which is Serverless Security. So what that means is for the rest of the month, we're going to talk about serverless on each of our episodes. Today, we're talking about, that's what it says over there, security governance and compliance in a serverless application. And for those who are watching a replay, the questions would appear as a chapter later on. So you would be able to come back and I guess like and subscribe if you want. But before further, I go into explaining about all this, I hope, let me introduce you to my new guest over here, who's going to kick off the Serverless Security Month. By the way, good morning, Vineet. Happy Diwali to you as well, my friend. Thanks for the speaks as well, by the way. I've got the intro music. Hey, John, welcome.
Hey, Ashish, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for coming to the show, man. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
By the way, cheers, man. Thanks for coming with a drink as well for virtual coffee. I appreciate that. Cheers. I always appreciate folks who join me for virtual coffee from far and afar. But John, maybe before we get into this, I think a great place to start would be for people who may not know of you. I'm sure a lot of people in Pittsburgh know about you and around the US as well, maybe around Australia as well. I would love to know your journey into kind of the cybersecurity kind of space.
Yeah, sounds great. So, my name's Jon Zeolla. I started in technology back in the GeoCities era. I don't know if any of you remember that, but whenever you could kind of hand code your own HTML and whip up a little homepage, I thought that was cool to do when I was in elementary school, middle school. Started getting interested in technology. I remember printing out the HTML spec and just like reading it line for line for line. Like that's how I got introduced to it.
Wow, okay.
I didn't know that there was any other way. So so that's how I started getting interested in technology. Thank you, GeoCities. I got interested in security probably middle school to high school when I was trying to play video games or do something that the school didn't want me to do. And so I spent a lot of my time finding out how to bypass their security controls.
Right.
A lot of old school things, like if you could run the @ command, you could say like @ 1 minute from now, run explorer.exe, and then kill Explorer, it would reload a system and it would bypass a lot of their control, things like that, right? Like little things. Just kind of got interested in that sort of stuff. I found some things on my school network at one point and got myself hired by them when I was a senior and did some security stuff for them. And, kind of went from there. I was really into the kind of theater, like hacking in movies and things like that. Went to school for it. Got a first job. My first job was not in security though. It was more what we would call nowadays like a DevOps engineer. Back then that was called a software engineer, but I was really focused on the automation for deploying prod and non-prod environments for a pretty big bank. Jumped into NetSec, did some security general work at another company. And immediately prior to my current position, I was a security engineer at a research institution. So we did a ton of open source things there. That was a lot of fun. I joined the Apache Software Foundation, worked on a thing called Apache Metron for a while there. And then about 5 years ago, I started, co-founded my own company called CISO. And so we do security consulting stuff, right? And we help companies with modern tech stacks. build out security programs, a lot of cloud native stuff. And those programs often need to be certified or attested in some way. And so for roughly the last 5 years, I've been spending a lot of time in ISO 27001, SOC 2, high trust, FedRAMP, things like that.
Oh, awesome. And perfect kind of conversation we want over here as well. So it turns out there are other people as well who had a HTML book. So Vineet is one of our audiences, and he did that too. So he used to carry around a HTML black book. How cool is that? So there was another Jon in the making on the other side of the world.
Very cool.
Well, welcome, Martinez. Evening from windy London, just relaxing after 3 hours of AWS SSA study. Oh my God. Good job, man. 3 hours of studying for AWS. Martinez, welcome. Hopefully we can make you feel a bit relaxed and think about something else, but serverless is probably not the thing you want to jump into. Hopefully this is an interesting one for you as well, Martinez. Now, the first question to today's topic, serverless security. I know few people talk about it from a different perspective, have different, I guess it's the same thing as cloud security. What is really cloud security? So I'm keen to know your definition of what do you classify as, hey, what's your meaning for serverless security when you talk about it?
Yeah, I don't really have a great special definition for serverless security. I think I typically go back to the kind of CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. That takes an interesting spin when you get into serverless. Some attacks like denial of wallet attacks where it's kind of like a DDoS, but focused on spending your resources as the host or the person paying the cloud bill for your serverless. So I think that it takes a little bit of an interesting spin. But honestly, I'm not a big fan of needing to separate definitions of serverless security versus cloud security versus AppSec and things like that. We could go down that road for forever.
Okay, there's another one of those. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Cool. So maybe I think we talk about serverless primarily when I guess when a lot of people talk, and because it's the first episode, I do want to cover some of the foundational pieces as well. Because when people talk about serverless, they only think about, say, a cloud server provided serverless like a Lambda or Google Function or Azure. Are there more varieties, or is that the only kind? And they're the ones who are pioneering just serverless functions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there definitely are others, right? The CNCF's serverless working group maintains a landscape page, which is really useful. Of kind of what the other providers are in the area. Ones that I hear frequently are Knative, OpenWhisp, Whisk, Kubeless, OpenFaz, things like that. Yeah, so there's a few different projects. OpenWhisk is an Apache project, so a lot of open source ones, and a lot of different options out there. I definitely see people using the cloud provided options, right? Like functions and Lambda and such that you mentioned earlier, a lot more often, but there are on-prem or kind of alternative non-cloud CSP hosted options. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, maybe we should probably, being Cloud Security Podcast, we'll probably just focus on the cloud ones. But it's actually good to know that there are other ones as well. Maybe, and I'm going to put the link for the CNCF landscape thing on the show notes so people can kind of go in and have a look at it as well. Now, talking about compliance and governance, you mentioned you've been doing ISO and I guess the FedRAMPs of the world. But is serverless something that can have, does it have features to be compliant in the first place? Because I always wonder if it's one of those, what's it called, shared responsibility model where just hand it off to the cloud service provider. Are there any things like that?
Yeah, that's a great conversation. We could talk about that for the rest of this chat. The short answer is yes, right? Like, so you can build a serverless environment to be compliant with these different frameworks. And just to kind of list them real quick, like what are the frameworks that I'm thinking of when I say that? SOC 2, it's ISO 27001, it's high trust, it's FedRAMP. You could also maybe include things like PCI, although that's really like a contractual obligation, HIPAA, high tech, GDPR, things like that, right? So some people include those in the mix. I'm primarily talking about that first grouping, the high trust, FedRAMP, ISO SOC realm. And actually, so when I'm building an environment or helping people design an environment, a lot of times when compliance is a requirement, that drives the move to serverless because it removes a lot of the need. You mentioned the shared responsibility model. It moves a lot more of that to the CSP than on yourself. And so you have a kind of a smaller slice of that pie, of that shared responsibility that you need to worry about when you're being audited. For those sort of, some of them are certifications, some of them aren't. SOC 2 is an attestation. FedRAMP is different as well, but with high trust in ISO, it is a clear certification where you have a external auditor come in and say like, oh yes, you are now certified because you have a X. There's a little nuance in that too. So for instance, with ISO 27001, you can't actually have your technology, your product be certified. That's not what they will certify. They're certifying what they call the ISMS.
Yeah.
And that is the environment that surrounds that serverless environment. And you can put that serverless environment in scope for your ISO audit. But you can't say that is ISO certified. It's the ISMS. It's essentially the processes that support security around that serverless environment that you can get certified. But that being said, ISO still has NXA. And although it's the least prescriptive of the bunch, it does have some things that are mandatory, some things that are required, and so your serverless environment would need to support those, and it can, right? I've helped multiple companies kind of go through that process without a hitch. It's definitely possible. Good.
No, sorry. I was going to say, so that's such an interesting point, because what that means is for companies who have applications which are fully serverless, then probably, then to your point, the slice of compliance responsibility is quite low. But for people who may be using a mix of, I've got some serverless, I've got some EC2, I've got something else, and something else, but that's my entire ISMS system, then Lambda is technically just a very small slice of even that compliance piece at that point.
Yep. Yeah. And it gets interesting too, because when you are working to get certified and as you're building your security program around those systems, there's lots of different ways you can do it. You could do process-based assessments, asset-based assessments, controls-based assessments, right? Like there's all kinds of these different angles that you can take. And in a lot of cases, you have some flexibility on how you're going to do that. And sometimes the auditors are prescribed a methodology when they're going to be looking at your environment. They're going to go the asset-based way or the process-based way, right? ISO is big on the process matrix, right? And understanding kind of who owns what and how. It's about the ISMS, right? Whereas others are different. NIST, FedRAMP is all about controls-based, right? There's even that OSCAL project, which is very clearly says in their documentation, this only supports controls-based assessments, right? So they want to go that route. But so it depends a little bit on which certification or attestation you're going for, which angles are feasible. But yeah, there's a few different angles of ways that you can assess the environment for security in general.
Would you say, or maybe another great place to, I guess, kind of digging into this conversation could also be talking about the building blocks for how people can start building towards we kind of separated out, hey, if you're thinking of compliance in a serverless environment, probably need to look at from, hey, is this just my entire product is serverless? I've got thousands of Lambda functions running, or is it more that you just have one component? So for people who may have a lot of components or maybe one component serverless, what are some of the building blocks to start with from a security and compliance perspective? Because I feel like there's a few layers of defense I'm sure you can put into serverless as well.
Yeah, I would say that so first of all, that depends a little bit on the scope, right? Like you are able to scope your ISO certification or SOC 2 or whatever to a specific area. And sometimes it would make sense to just exclude your serverless or only include your serverless, like maybe draw a boundary between them. That's the thing that I see people do a lot. But in particular, when we're thinking about these certifications on a serverless environment, a lot of it comes down to just your application security practices, right? And so while they're going to need to see, like in FedRAMP world, some sort of diagram with your SSP, like an authorization boundary, knowing where the data is going, and some data flow diagrams, you can provide security a lot of different ways. In the design of it, obviously there's a diagram, but also if you're deploying that diagram with infrastructure as code, being able to apply, show that you have some sort of security controls around that infrastructure as code deployment. There's tons of different ways to do that. I think Checkoff is a really good one. Kix is another. Terrascan, TFSec. There's a lot of options on the market. I even have a little Docker container I open sourced that brings those together and makes it kind of easy to run in a pipeline. But just doing something in your infrastructure as code security is a key part of those like building blocks when you're deploying serverless, because you're probably going to be using a lot of different, like say if you're in AWS, you're going to use a few different functions that you might use. CloudFront, you might probably going to use some WAFs. You're obviously going to use Lambdas, step functions, S3 buckets, Kinesis, things like that. There's also just a lot of pipeline security to think about. So your traditional static code analysis, dynamic code analysis, software composition analysis tooling, and ensuring that the code that you're deploying is secure. And then there's runtime security too, right? Like, so just because you don't manage the operating system doesn't mean you don't need to think about how things will actually operate in runtime. So, something that I see people use frequently in the AWS Lambda world is layers. And so to deploy kind of these approved centralized configurations for logging or for some, different sort of protection mechanisms and have one way to do it to kind of centralize your decentralized deployment, is another like really important building block, and having maybe a little bit more scrutiny over that, especially if it's authentication authorization based, or if it's cryptography based or something along those lines, just making sure that it gets a little bit extra scrutiny before it gets deployed, and just having all of your serverless functions use those shared layers.
Oh, right. I mean, it sounds like a lot of moving parts as well. I mean, kind of like any other application as well. You have the runtime, the compile time, for lack of a better word. You have the CI/CD pipeline as well. So maybe in the work that you've done, what are some of the example architectures that you come across for serverless? Like, what are people using them for usually?
Yeah. I think the most traditional one is like an event-driven architecture, something where you maybe have a web application, a single-page app with a bunch of JavaScript, and it makes API calls from time to time as the users are interacting with the front end, and serving those APIs in the serverless, putting an API gateway in front, and then hooking that into serverless is a pretty popular one. I've also seen some data engineering, like kind of data pipelines use cases, where you have lots of information coming in. Maybe it's some sort of a feed or a dump, or maybe even old school like FTP. Someone's dumping something on a server somewhere, and you want to pick that up and make it more modern from then on, right? Or you could use there are FTP services, SaaS services and stuff. But taking the data, parsing it, taking the rows or the sections of the data which are valid, and kind of moving them on to the next step, and processing them, cleaning them, preparing them for, if you're doing machine learning, it's really important to have really clean data. But even just any sort of data-based visualization, having really clean information is important. Kind of ETL jobs, right? Extracting things from a data store, tweaking them a little bit, and loading them somewhere else. And I've even seen monitoring. So although a lot of the environments I work in, people are using like, Prometheus and Grafana's and things like that for their health monitoring and things like that. I've seen scenarios where it made sense to kind of just throw a Lambda out there and say, on this sort of cadence, check in on this, other thing. Maybe it's a traditional app, maybe it's something deployed into Kubernetes, and you, for whatever reason, want to add something on top of that, using serverless for those sort of like quick and easy jobs to deploy. Maybe it's even time bound, right? Like, I just need this for the next 3 months. I don't want to have to deal with spinning up a server or doing a Kubernetes deployment or anything like that. Like, I just want something quick. Using serverless for that as well makes sense.
Right. It's an interesting point. I don't know why people use for FTP, but sure, upload files to Lambda functions as well. But maybe those are good examples, because I'm going to think, as you're going to go into them, I'm just thinking in my mind, so wait, if I'm approaching compliance for my serverless application, obviously we spoke about the CI/CD pipeline, we spoke about runtime, all these other things as well. Now, natively, are there any features that are kind of, so with the modern compliance in mind, where a lot of people are talking about, hey, why not just use a cloud native service? I'm just making it up, like, my Lambda is already FedRAMP certified. Maybe not the application being hosted by it, but the Lambda by itself is. Like, are there things like that you kind of see auditors are comfortable to kind of pick that up?
Yeah, I mean, especially in the FedRAMP world, yes. So, and especially at the higher levels of FedRAMP, like if you're talking about FedRAMP High, we're actually going to be in a Gov Cloud. You know, that there's a ton of reason to deploy your application in a kind of cloud native serverless way, making sure that you don't accidentally use a cryptographic method that's not allowed, or you store a private key material in a certain way that you don't want to. Just using those sorts of cloud environments where they kind of remove the ability to shoot yourself in the foot, right? They remove the sort of methods that wouldn't be sanctioned for those sorts of deployments is really key and critical. And that also kind of goes back to a little bit the infrastructure as code when you're deploying these things, you know, putting the configurations in place that allow this or don't allow that. You know, one example is, so you can use Rego rules with a bunch of different tools like Kix, or I believe Checkoff also supports Rego. And you know, I've seen some people say, "Oh, I have a tagging strategy where every S3 bucket or every resource that gets deployed needs to have a data classification key, and then the values are one of this list, right?" And you can say, if in a pipeline we identify that someone is writing Terraform that says that creates an S3 bucket, and that S3 bucket has a tag of data classification equals ISO 27001 or FedRAMP moderate or things like that, then you can have custom Rego policies that make sure that the configuration of the cloud resource is, you know, using server-side encryption, requiring multi-factor for deletes, you know, whatever it is. But if the tag is something different, like you're tagging it for, you know, a SOC 2 that might be a lower bar, you might not have that as a requirement, just a preference. And for cost reasons or complexity reasons, you might choose not to do that. And it's kind of something that you can, again, push it early in your CI process to ensure that you're meeting whatever requirements you have.
So wait, do people use compliance the tag as well in resources? That's an interesting one, because normally when people talk about tagging, they're really normally talking about the fact that, hey, this is for business unit X, and so this is my tag. This machine would run from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Like, I've seen those kind of people use that for compliance as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. I've seen the criticality of the assets being indicated, the sensitivity of the information. That's a really key one. Like if you have a data classification governance that says all of your resources need to be X or Y or Z, you know, public or confidential or regulated or you know, whatever. Or if you want to better define your boundaries, so you have, some people will just use like a multi-subscription or a multi-account way to do that, and they'll say everything in this one AWS account is ISO 27001, everything in this is SOC 2, but that gets confusing when you start overlapping, or whenever you do a scope expansion of your certification. You're like, oh, I want to add this in. Like, oh, well, now I need to, it's like this in half of that AWS account, and things along those lines. And so what I've seen be successful is using tagging to define that. And then, you know, everything, I feel like everything is kind of downstream from metadata in right? So like, if you just put good metadata on everything, then you can automate the rest.
100%. Because I was kind of, as you were kind of saying it, I'm going, oh, okay. Because I think a lot of examples that I've seen for compliance has usually been, hey, we'll have this separate, now whether it's an AWS account or Azure subscription or Google account, the way they kind of do it, I'm going to separate my compliance components so they don't talk to anything else, because I don't know what kind of auditor I might get. I don't want to throw heat at any auditors. I'm sure they're great ones as well. But I find that the whole aspect of kind of where the question started, where people, auditors being okay with using a cloud service as a tick for a control. I feel bad saying that, but I don't know, what's your experience been over there?
There's a lot of other cool things you can do when you start tagging resources. So I'm involved in a lot of audits, right? Usually kind of supporting my clients on the technical side or coaching them. And one of the things we always say is answer their question, be honest, but don't offer more information than what they're asking for, right? When they ask a question, answer that question. Don't answer questions they didn't ask. And so what I see a lot of times is the auditor says, hey, you say here you encrypt everything at rest. Do you have any EC2s? And they say, yeah. Or do you have, you know, whatever? And they'll kind of spin up the AWS console, and they'll start showing all of the EBSs that they have, all of them. When what I coach them to do, and this is where you bring the tagging in, you can filter on, you know, scope ISO 27001, now they're only ever going to see the things that are in scope for that audit. You could even do an ad hoc tagging for that audit. You could put like something very specific. And then for the rest of the audit, you can make sure that you're only showing them that specific slice. And again, this whole conversation that we're talking about now, are disks encrypted or whatever, is a great problem in a non-serverless world. But in a serverless world, at least in the areas that I'm familiar with, more so in the AWS and the Azure realms, these things are just like encrypted at rest is kind of a claim that the cloud provider gives to you, like that they provide. And so as far as shared responsibility goes, like I don't have to worry about disks. I don't have to worry about that. Like I know that, if I go to their documentation and I look at what they're saying that they do, they say that all of the storage for, these sorts of things are encrypted, and we're great. Just go look. Auditor can go look at the AWS documentation instead of looking in my AWS console. It's a much more safe thing to do, I think.
Oh, cool. And I think so. You find that sometimes it's us ourselves are trying to kind of shoot us on our foot, I guess, by showing more than what's required, and that's kind of makes us not fail the audit, but at least makes the situation a bit more difficult in front of an auditor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just spurs questions. You start going down paths that you might not want to go into, or maybe you just weren't prepared to go down it. Like sometimes you want audits to go very smoothly, and you want to be able to prepare, and you can't prepare for everything, so you want to prepare a specific scope, right? And then keep the conversation on that scope is
and use tagging in that context. So, but I guess just to I think we kind of touched on it, but so that I have a clear answer for it. But are auditors open to the idea of, say, using, to your point about encryption, if there's encryption from AWS, that works. It's acceptable. Versus, hey, how do you do your auditing? Oh, it's a service from my Azure provider. Like, is that acceptable, or is that not a thing at the moment? Like, because do they know about it? At least the ones that we're not talking about the rest of the world. They're gentrifying it.
Yeah. Do they know about it? That's like a key thing. So my experience over the past few years of going through these audits and certifications and attestations and stuff, serverless or not, is that the serverless components of the environment, a lot of auditors just aren't familiar with it yet. And so that means that they're not comfortable. That causes them to ask extra questions and spend extra time on it. Sometimes it's a good thing. If you're extremely buttoned up, great. Spend as much time putting magnifying glass to the things that we have really nailed. But sometimes it's not. And so I always say that if you get to know your auditor a little bit, and if they aren't comfortable, spend some time getting them comfortable. It's probably in your best interest to help them understand the design choices, why you chose to go serverless, and specifically from the security side, what guarantees you have, what expectations you have, where the improvements from the shared responsibility model are, things like that. I've heard lots of, in the FedRAMP space, like government entities being uncomfortable when you start bringing up, we're going to use lambdas for this inside the authorization boundary. They're like, whoa, like, I don't think we want that. And in some cases, it's because, years and years and years ago, when this was a really early feature, there were some controls gaps, right? And some of them just kind of are holding on to that. And in some cases, they just don't know what to make of that. And they know if you have an EC2, that's a server, and they know how to deal with servers, right? And so spending the time to kind of educate whoever's your interested parties, right? Often your auditor, sometimes whoever's sponsoring you, if it's a FedRAMP, things along those lines. It's really important.
Awesome. And so the education piece is important. I've got a question here from Shashant Kode, and I believe we kind of answered it, but unless you had any more thoughts on this. His question was, how do you implement layered security in a serverless framework? We kind of touched on the whole runtime and unless you want to add anything else more, I'll probably ask Sushant to kind of rewind once the replay is available. But did you want to add anything else to this?
I've seen a lot of interesting rollouts of kind of layers specific to like within the Lambda layers. The way I'm reading that question is also just layered security in general. And so you can architect Lambda to be front-ended by a WAF, right? So you could use the AWS WAF, and you could put some controls at that level. You could use all kinds of techniques throughout the stack for encrypting and decrypting traffic and doing introspection. You could do network-based monitoring, especially if you have the ability to to decrypt. You could do a network security monitor style techniques. You could span the traffic off separate and have detection mechanisms there. There's a few different ways that you can do it. It's definitely in my opinion a little bit more limited than traditional mechanisms, and I think that's a good thing. It reduces the number of options, things that you have to consider as your layers of security. At the end of the day, I haven't found a situation where I was clearly able to say like, oh, like the traditional way is better. Running a server or Kubernetes would have been much better for this one use case. And I'm talking mostly, within the last 6 to 12 months, that has been more the case than as opposed to like years past.
All right. And I think it's worthwhile definitely calling out serverless doesn't solve all the problems as well. You probably want to find the right tool for the right job. And I think actually funny enough, he's got another follow-up question. Any suggestions on serverless security best practices, which is probably kind of tying back to your layered approach before, where you said you had a WAF. I think you can probably add identity and access management as well. Like I think the AWS context, the IAM role that you have on your Lambda functions should not be overprivileged.
Yep.
And it's because there is a whole, and I don't know if this changed because AWS keeps changing this. Because not all Lambda functions are public facing as well. They could be private facing ones as well, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I believe each function needs to have its own IAM role. So sometimes you get a little bit of sprawl there, and like if you're at really high scale, the manageability of that can be difficult. But but you do have to have a role for each one, and that means that you can measure it and identify if it's meeting whatever expectations you have. But I think that when I think of serverless security best practices, I really go back to application security best practices, right? Adding security into your pipeline, having a secure design of the stack itself, and being able to talk through that and scan it for issues. I typically go towards, for serverless security, some sort of IAC based scanning and deployment. But you could do audits of the workloads of the environment in the console or with other sorts of tools too. I think things like Prowler, CrowdMapper, things like that. I believe those have some support for serverless environments. So a lot of it goes back to, in my opinion, really traditional application security best practices. You have SBOMs and software composition analysis. You're not using some third-party library that's from the 1990s. And
actually, that's a good point, because the kind of touching on this shared responsibility thing that we were talking about earlier, and that the traditional models don't really apply in a serverless context, because technically all you're doing is, if I were to kind of take a 10,000 feet view of serverless app deploying applications, we just have a function that someone in our company has written, like a Lambda function, which could be .NET, Python, whatever. We just drop that into AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, and then that just runs based on a trigger that you've created. So from a responsibility perspective, if you don't have a storage that you require for your function to run, then there is no need for a storage. Compute is owned by them, so there's no antivirus or malware protection. None of that stuff is going to work as well. And WAF probably is important, because if it's internet facing and you have, although I sometimes wonder, WAF definitely would play a huge role from a OWASP top 10 or whatever you want to call it. Maybe like a denial of wallet, maybe can you prevent it by that as well? I don't know if that's even a thing.
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. You probably could, because you could write rules like if you're seeing an excess number of requests from a single IP or from a certain user agent string or something like that, you could start to deny them instead of just allowing them to spend your money like crazy by spinning up new instances.
Yeah,
I haven't actually run into that before, but I'd expect you could do some things like that.
Yeah, and I just realized, as I mentioned it, I'm like, you and I know what denial of wallet is, but other people may not know what denial of wallet attack is. So do you want to just like touch on what is the denial of wallet attack in a serverless context?
Yeah. So with serverless, serverless, one of the tenets of serverless is that scalability is not your problem; it's the cloud provider's problem, right? At least when we're talking about CSP provided serverless environments. And so it's someone else's problem. And so in response to traffic, you will scale up, and in response to reductions in traffic, you'll scale down. A denial of wallet is a scenario where the type of traffic causes there to be additional expenses on the hosting side. So whether it's long-lived requests, things that they know will take a long time, or just a quantity of them, just kind of dinging your wallet, the credit card that's attached to your the billing account, and costing you as the provider, as the person running the application, running money.
Yeah, awesome. Great description. I think so, and I think that's a very common thing which is seen in I guess, the serverless function world. The other one probably, and I'm sure you can add to that as well, is that the whole IAM role. So if you have, we mentioned FTP servers earlier, which is like, oh my god, why would you put an FTP Lambda? But sure, but I think the whole idea behind that is there is a great talk gone in 60 seconds something from on DEF CON, which is someone who's uploaded a file onto a Lambda function. They found out it was a container running in the background and were able to get a reverse shell back out. So you almost go like,
Yeah.
so why would you go file upload in the first place? Because you don't really have any control in the compute. But I don't know, do you have any more examples of things that you've heard about in the serverless attack world?
Yeah, probably not a ton. No, that's an interesting one. I recall seeing some stuff on Twitter about that presentation. I don't think I actually have seen it yet, but I could kind of guess at some of the interesting nuances of.
And I think
in other like non-AWS environments, there were similar problems like that, and you were able to do some like lateral movement, and there were some interesting things identified like years ago. I forget which cloud that was, but yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's where I guess the identity and access management piece we spoke about earlier kind of fits in as well. Like if your Lambda function or if your AWS function, Azure function has privilege to do a lot more damage, then maybe that kind of becomes a bit more challenging at that point. But hopefully that answered your question, Sushant. And the serverless security best practices to start off with, and maybe some common attacks you want to look out for. And we're kind of towards the tail end of the show as well. And I kind of wanted to kind of give some guidance for folks who are listening to this for the first time, and where can they go and learn about compliance and serverless, especially like now Martinez is working on studying up for his AWS solution architect associate exam. I wonder, what's a great place to start thinking about compliance and the whole serverless security world? Like where can people find more information about relevant to this?
Yeah, probably two different recommendations there, maybe three. On the compliance world, like each certification, attestation, compliance framework, whatever you want to call them, is handled very differently, right? So if you're interested in FedRAMP or working with the U.S. government, for instance, following things from the DoD, the DHS, GSA, NIST, those all make sense. I'm a big fan of following the NIST's special publication drafts when they get released. Gives an interesting eye and a kind of inside loop to some of the things that are happening there. And it's usually for a reason. It's usually preempting some sort of later on step of a requirement in 853 or FedRAMP or something along those lines. And a lot of other frameworks look to NIST, at least ones that are based in the US, as influence to how they operate. So that gets you really the kind of upstream look. ISO is great, but pretty much to see anything there, you need to spend some money. It's not a ridiculous amount of money, but you spend a couple $100 there, a couple $100 there on different specs. ISO 27001 points to ISO 27002, and then there's 27017 and 18 and 27701, and then there's the auditor guidance, and each one of those is going to be a couple $100. So that one can be a little bit more difficult, but starting at 27001 could be a good place if that's what you're interested in. There's also on the serverless side, I'm a huge fan of open source, and I'm a huge fan of some specific communities that are out there. The OSSF is doing really great work recently. The CNCF as well. There's the CNCF tag security, the technical advisory group for security, and there's some initiatives going on there with regard to serverless. There is the serverless working group within the CNCF, which is really doing some awesome work. I referenced them earlier in the landscape, but they've done some other things with like cloud events and things like that. My personal favorite way of getting to know this stuff is cherry picking very narrow use cases or scenarios, compliance requirements, whatever, and then doing some experimentation. Just kind of like playing around, spin up some Lambdas yourself. I think my first thing was I wanted to know when a specific commit in an open source project was included in a release of that project, so I could actually tell people to start using it. Because I'm usually like either putting in an issue or contributing something, and there's a commit when it gets merged, but I'm waiting for that to get released. So I made a API gateway Lambda, like kind of a pretty small stack. That was the first scenario that I did. myself in Lambdas, and I just would query it with this little client that I wrote in Python, and used IAM authentication and just said like, hey, here's a commit and here's a repo. Is that in a release yet? And I made a bunch of GitHub queries happen, and it would say, yep, it's in a release XYZ. You can go use this. It's kind of stable now or not. So yeah, I highly recommend experimenting and just kind of playing around and these kind of use cases that you think you might want to recommend to someone else. Do them yourself, get a feel for the pros and cons, and in some cases how bad the documentation is around how to use them. But yeah, that's what I would recommend.
No, thanks for sharing that. I think I'll put the resources for the CNCF on as well. I think we have you and I are working on a serverless white paper as well, so we can probably hopefully release that to the public and get some more insight from there as well. For maybe someone like Shashank would have his answer for more specific answer for serverless security practices, at least as collectively thought by more than 25 people who are involved in that conversation. But exactly. That's kind of like the technical questions. Like, this is kind of like now the last section, which is a fun question section. There's 3, not too many. I want for the folks to kind of get to know you a bit more beyond the technology side of things, I guess. So the first one being, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on, say, serverless, compliance, or cloud or technology? What's your things that you want to spend most time on?
Yeah, I'm pretty narrowly focused right now, but I would say that my one side hobby is mountain biking.
Nice.
I just convinced myself that I've been doing it for long enough to invest in a really nice bike. So I've got a really solid mountain bike now, and I've been doing it for like the last 4 years or so. There's actually a small group. I'm based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States. And there's like maybe 10 or 12 of us in InfoSec locally that all kind of go around to the different mountain biking spots. And that's how I spend my free time when I have it. Awesome.
That's a great way to do it as well, man. I think outdoor is good, especially with COVID. I think most people are like, anything outdoor is great.
Exactly.
So next one is, what is something that you're proud of, but is not on your social media?
Well, that's probably an easy one because I don't put a ton of stuff on social media. I don't think I've even put, so the tool I referenced earlier is called Easy Infra. I don't think I've put anything about that on social media at all. So I would have to say that. That's something I've been working on for about a year now. It's just, I've used it internally, and I've got a few clients using it as well, and hoping to get more adoption of that. So if anyone's interested, check out Easy Infra. It's kind of supposed to be a pretty seamless way to introduce security scanning to CI or CD processes when you do infrastructure as code.
I'll put the link for that in the show notes as well. Final question. What's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share?
Oh, this is super easy. So in Pittsburgh, we have this thing called a Pittsburgh salad. What it is a normal salad, and then you put French fries on top of it. And you usually use ranch as the dressing because why wouldn't you? So you feel like you're being healthy, but you're actually just eating French fries with ranch. And so that's like by far one of my favorite. You add a protein to it too, like put steak on it or chicken or something like that. But yeah, definitely the Pittsburgh salad is definitely my favorite.
So is Pittsburgh salad like readily available anywhere? Like, or is it more like you go to like a Pittsburgh salad shop? Or is it,
no.
How common is it?
Like probably 60% of the shops around here, the restaurants that have salads, you could probably get
Pittsburgh salad
at. Yeah, and in fact, sometimes it's assumed, and you don't even really know unless you kind of look at the fine print. You're like, okay, this is just a regular, egg salad, and it comes out with a bunch of French fries on it, and it's like steaming hot. And I'm like, yes. I didn't even think that I was gonna get this, but I did. It's great.
Oh, cool. Okay, now I'm gonna try that out. Now since the space opened up, hopefully I can come on that side, East Coast, and try some of this out, man. But thanks so much for I really enjoyed my conversation. So thanks so much for spending time with us. I really would like to kind of keep elaborating a bit more on this, maybe once we release the white paper as well. But I do appreciate you spending time with us and answering the questions from everyone else over here as well. But where can people find you if they want to connect with you outside of this?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Jon Zeolla, JONZEOLLA. And I'm also on LinkedIn. That's probably the two best ways to connect with me. I'm also on GitHub, Jon Zeolla as well. I'm not very unique. I just use the same thing across.
No, fair enough. Thanks. So Vineet enjoyed the session as well. So great job, man. But thanks so much for your time. I will see you hopefully on my next CNCF conversation. Thanks, Martinez, for coming in as well. Hopefully, good luck with your exam, man. I'll probably see you in the next CNCF meeting. But I think for everyone else, I will see you on the next weekend for another topic of serverless security. But thank you, Jon, for coming in, and we will talk to you soon. All right, thanks everyone. See ya. Bye.